Thanks. And like everybody else, I want to thank the organizers for this really great workshop. A lot of good people, a lot of really good talks. Okay, so if we're going to wonder about the conceptual foundations of cognitive science as being representation, I think one question that we need to focus upon, it was a question that came out in Frankie's talk, is what sort of ontological stance do theorists take towards the representations that they invoke? Or maybe actually, I think a maybe more interesting question, certainly a more philosophical question, is what sort of an ontological stance ought they to take towards the representations? What sort of stance should they take? Now, at least initially, you might think, well, this is a pretty simple question, and it has a couple of straightforward answers. Right? Either you're a realist about those posits, you think there really are these sorts of structures in the brain that are playing some kind of representational role, or you're an eliminativist, and you deny that these representations actually exist. Now, of course, you could have sort of a mixed view where you're a realist about some sorts of posits and an eliminativist about other sorts of posits. I tend to sort of take that view. But generally speaking, with regard to any particular representational posit, it seems like there's really only two metaphysical stances that you can take. But in truth, in cognitive science, there's a history of people claiming that there's a third option, that there's something somewhere between straightforward realism on the one hand and out-and-out eliminativism on the other hand. And these are folks who claim that we should not view the positing of representations as in some way a commitment to, an ontological commitment to, actual neurological structures that are representing. So to some degree, these folks are saying that in the scientific invoking of representations, we should take a stance that's perhaps somewhat similar to Dennett's stance with regard to propositional attitudes. Right? In both cases, the claim is that the assignment of intentional states does not involve a commitment to there actually being structures in the brain that have actual representational content. Okay, so my goal today is to argue against this picture, to argue against this idea of a third option. I don't think it accurately captures what's going on in cognitive science, and I don't think that that interpretation is going to have the best outcome for cognitive science. So basically, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between robust realism, eliminativism, and then what I'm going to talk about is deflationism. I'm going to say something about what I think a robust realist can accept, what a realist can tolerate with regard to representation. And then I'm going to ask, are there any really good reasons for, say, preferring realism over deflationism? I'm going to look at some different considerations, and I'll give one reason for thinking, at least I believe, why we should treat realism as the default position, making it the case then that deflationism, the burden is on the deflationist to show why that's a better view. And then what I'm going to do, there's all sorts of different kinds of deflationism, so I can only really focus on a few. I'm going to focus on three types of deflationism and try to explain why they don't work. I'm going to focus on Chomsky's, what Frankie's described as a kind of ersatz representationalism. I want to talk about Mark Spivak's interesting deflationism that he calls neural representational fictionalism. And then I want to talk about Frankie's intentional gloss, some of which you just heard about a minute ago. So that's basically the game plan. Okay, so what exactly is robust representational realism? Well, it's essentially, ontologically, a claim about what the invoking of representations in cognitive theories entails. Essentially, it claims that when theorists posit representations, when they're trying to give an account of cognition, they're committing themselves to the existence of actual, real, discoverable structures that are in some way functioning as representations at some level of analysis. Okay, so that's pretty vague, but I think it's good enough for our purposes. These representations essentially have some kind of intentional content, and they have a lot of the other features that we associate with representation. For example, the capacity for misrepresentation, and some kind of non-derived, or at least some kind of non-conventional sort of content. Okay, so realism says that we should treat these theories literally. That when researchers invoke representations, they're literally trying to explain what's happening in the brain. And if it should turn out that these representational structures don't exist, then these theories are just straightforwardly false, at least in that regard. Okay? Now, realism has to be distinguished then from anti-realism, but there's two different kinds of anti-realism that we really need to keep separate. There's one kind of anti-realism that actually is just straightforward eliminativism, right? Realists say that the representational structures exist. Anti-realists who are eliminativists say that they don't actually exist. But for the purposes of my talk, the realists and the eliminativists are actually allies. They're allies because for the most part they agree upon the truth conditions of those representational theories. They both agree that for these representational theories to be true, there really do have to be these representational structures. Okay? But that's to be distinguished from a different kind of anti-realism, and that different kind of anti-realism is what I want to focus upon. This other kind of anti-realism denies that when researchers invoke representations, they're committing themselves to the existence of actual discoverable representational entities or representational structures. Okay, so any sort of account, there's lots of different kinds of anti-realism of this sort, but any account that claims that the invoking of representations is a kind of instrumentalism or a mere heuristic or maybe some kind of fictional gloss, that's belonging in this other camp of anti-realism, and that's really what I want to focus upon. Okay, so these sorts of views deny that the value of representational theories depends upon the existence of actual representational structures in the brain. To avoid confusion, from here on out, I'm just going to call this type of anti-realism deflationism. Okay? Now, I also want to distinguish deflationism from another type or another way of deflating representation that's often now referred to as liberalism. And this other way of deflating representation is to offer extremely weak sufficient conditions for what it is for something to qualify as a representation. So, for example, Markman and Dietrich offered a proposal of representation where to qualify as a representation, something really just had to be some sort of causal mediator or causal mediator that in some sense carries information, but very weak conditions for something to be a representation. Now, as many people pointed out, I've railed against these sorts of accounts. I don't think they work, but I don't attack them because I think they reject realism, right? These folks think these structures are real. They actually do exist in the brain. There really are these causal mediators. I just don't think they work because I think they're mischaracterizing what it is to be a representation. So this way of deflating representation I'm not going to talk about because these folks in my mind are still realists in the relevant sense. Okay, now, I think robust realism is a fairly strong view, but I think it can tolerate a lot of different aspects or a lot of different ways in which the invoking of representations is problematic. Okay? And one thing, for example, and I think this is an area where Frank and I really disagree, is that I think you can be a realist and tolerate some degree of indeterminacy, both with regard to representational function and with regard to representational content. All right? With regard to function, I think most of us recognize that there are certain kinds of things or certain properties where there are borderline cases and we don't know quite what to say, right? I'm a realist about baldness, but I recognize that there can be certain cases where I don't know, there's no definitive answer as to whether or not an individual is actually bald. And I think the same is true about things playing a certain functional role. That there can be borderline cases, neurological cases where we don't quite know what to say, whether or not something is functioning as a representation. But the fact that there are borderline cases doesn't undermine the claim that there are clear-cut cases where something is playing that particular functional role. So I think with regard to functional roles, some degree of indeterminacy is allowed. With regard to content, and we may have to get this maybe a place where we really disagree, I think actually most robustly real representational systems carry with them some degree of indeterminacy of content. So I think of the fuel gauge in my car as a robustly real representational system. But if you ask me, okay, now does that fuel gauge represent the amount of unleaded regular fuel in the tank? Or just any kind of fuel, regardless of grade? Or does it represent some kind of fluid? If you think that there's no clear-cut, determinate, definitive answer to that question, that doesn't make you reject realism about the fuel gauge, right? It doesn't make you a deflationist about the fuel gauge. It seems to me that you can be a scientific realist and recognize that there are questions about nature that don't have definitive answers. And I think this also applies to cognitive representation. So, the famous, do the neurons in the frog's brain represent flies or moving small bits of food? Again, if you think there's no clear-cut answer to that question, that doesn't mean you have to be a deflationist about the representational role of those neurons. Okay, so I think that realism can tolerate a certain amount of indeterminacy, as a lot of teleosemantics like Dan point out, appealing to functional considerations, appealing to the actual role a representation was selected to perform, can reduce a lot of that indeterminacy. But if there's some residual indeterminacy that's left over, I think that's something a realist can live with. Okay. I think another thing that you can accept if you're a realist is you can acknowledge the different sorts of challenges and problems associated with trying to provide a naturalistic, physicalistic account of representation. Right? I mean, we all know how hard it is to try to explain how neurons can function as a representation and have some kind of content, right? That whole naturalistic project. Okay? But the key point that, and I think one of the reasons it's difficult is because the role of representing is not a straightforward causal role. Right? Representations signify something. They signal something, and they carry content, so that makes it difficult. But the fact that it's difficult to provide a naturalistic account of representation, I believe, doesn't mean that when you do provide a naturalistic account of representation, the account isn't realistic in nature. Right? So yeah, giving an account of representation is tricky, but trickiness is not a reason to be a deflationist. Okay. All right, and then another thing I think that you can tolerate, or certainly is not a problem for realism, is the idea that representation occurs at higher levels of analysis. Right? I mean, in some sense, representations are going to have to be instantiated in the brain, but if they're part of a higher level theory that treats them as computational states or algorithmic states that aren't defined in neurological terms, that's okay. Right? Realists recognize that nature comes at different levels of organization, and with that are different levels of analysis, and the posits that are at higher levels of analysis don't have to be regarded as, in some sense, unreal. Okay, so we can allow that there can be higher levels of analysis at which representations occur. Okay, so that's just a few things where I want to say that realism can tolerate certain problematic aspects of representation. Now, are there any reasons to prefer realism over deflationism, or are there reasons to prefer deflationism over realism? Well, I think one reason for taking realism seriously is that I believe it's the position that's adopted by the vast majority of cognitive scientists and people who invoke representations in their accounts of cognition. I think it's pretty easy to find passages and quotes that suggest that the scientists embrace a realist interpretation. They really do think that there are these representational structures in the brain. And I think it's actually very rare that you find a scientist who sort of goes out of his way to say, now you got to realize I don't really think that there are these structures there. I'm just positing this as a kind of fiction. I think that's actually very, very rare. So I think there's good reason to suppose that at least among scientists, the default position is realism. But of course, that doesn't really address the normative issue, right? That doesn't tell us, apart from what the scientists actually do, what should they do? Because actually somebody could consistently maintain that yes, the majority of scientists are realists, but they ought not to be. Okay? So, how should we answer this normative questions? Are there considerations that normatively lean in favor of realism versus some kind of deflationism? Well, one way you might try to answer this question is to appeal to your more general attitudes with regard to the broader scientific realism debates that are out there, right? So, for example, some of the arguments that might be used to defend scientific realism or entity realism in science in general could also be used to defend representational realism. So for example, Putnam's got this no miracles argument, right? He argues for realism by saying it would be a miracle if it was the case that our most successful scientific theories that have tremendous predictive success don't accurately describe the processes and mechanisms and structures that they appeal to in order to explain some sort of phenomena. That success would be a miracle. And that same sort of argument, it seems to me, could be used to defend representational realism, right? Because it seems like it actually would be a miracle or really surprising if you had an extremely successful cognitive theory with enormous predictive success. It posits the existence of representations in its explanations and predictions, and yet no such representations actually existed. It seems to me that would be very surprising. Okay. But in fairness, I think going the other way, there are arguments that are often used to defend deflationism, more general arguments for deflationism in science, or for kinds of anti-realism in science, and those could also be marshaled in favor of deflationism with regard to representations. So for example, one reason why people avoid realism in more general accounts of science is they have a somewhat skeptical view of unobservable entities. So people like Bos von Frossen suggest that we shouldn't adopt a realist interpretation of unobservable entities. We should at least be agnostic about them. Okay, well, given that neural representations are going to be very, very small, they're going to be these microscopic entities that in some sense are unobservable, then if you think we shouldn't be realists about unobservable entities, that would probably apply to neural representations as well. Okay? So with regard to these more general considerations, these more general arguments, it seems that it's sort of a draw. The arguments go back and forth. So I think it's worth asking, is there anything specific about representation itself? Is there anything about the way in which representations are posited, or the kinds of things representations are supposed to be, that suggest a realist or deflationist interpretation? And here's one thing that I think does count and does support a realist interpretation. Representation is a functional notion. We think of representations as structures that play a particular functional role. And I think Peter Godfrey Smith is right to suggest that our conception of cognitive representation is in large measure modeled upon our understanding of non-cognitive representation, of things like fuel gauges and thermometers and maps and stuff like that that we use to get around, that we use in various ways. Now, these non-cognitive representations are very real, concrete structures of the world that play an important role in our lives. They're certainly not ontologically problematic, right? They're not like abstract entities or modal facts or something like that. Now, the cognitive scientists are saying something like this is taking place in the brain. There are structures like that that are functioning in the same way in the brain. And I think we should take those sorts of claims at face value. Right? To me, it's no different than, say, a cardiologist claiming, okay, there are parts of the heart that function as valves. We know that claim is true because when we look at the heart, we see that there's something in there that actually is playing the kind of role that we know valves to play. There's something in it that opens and closes, allows fluid to only go in one direction. And if there weren't those kinds of structures in the heart, then we would say that the claim that there are valves in the heart is mistaken. It's just straightforwardly wrong. To me, it seems like the same thing applies to representations. We're being told that there really are these sorts of structures in the brain, and I think we should take those claims at face value. That we should take those claims as being literally the case. Moreover, if there are these representations in the brain, then they have to be representations of something. They have to have some kind of content. You can't have representation without it being a representation about something. Again, going back to the heart, that's like saying you have something that's a pump, but there's actually nothing that it pumps. Right? There's no fluid, there's no gas, there's nothing that it's actually pumping. That just isn't possible. Right? These are things, for their instantiation, require that certain conditions be met. And just as you can't have a pump that doesn't pump something, so too you can't have a representation that isn't a representation of something. So there has to be some sort of content that goes there as well. Okay, so in my mind, that suggests that the proper default position, not just with regard to the description of what cognitive scientists think, but with regard to the normative question of what they ought to think and what we ought to think, the default view is realism. Right? The default view is to take these claims literally, and consequently the burden is upon the deflationists to show why realism is wrong. It seems to me that the burden is on them to explain why this realist interpretation is the wrong interpretation for cognitive theorizing that invokes representations. And essentially what I want to claim is that this burden hasn't been met. Okay? So there's all different sorts of deflationism that are out there. There's different kinds of deflationism. I don't have time to go through all of them. So what I want to do is I want to talk about 3 different versions of deflationism. I want to talk about Chomsky's ersatz representationalism. I want to talk about Mark Spivak's neurorepresentational fictionalism. And I want to talk about Frankie's intentional gloss. And what I'm going to argue is that in all 3 cases, it's either the case that the account just doesn't make sense, it just doesn't work, or it collapses into either a limitivism or robust realism. Okay, so that's the game plan. All right. The first deflationist account I want to look at is, surprisingly enough, from Noam Chomsky. I say surprisingly enough because we often think of Chomsky as the hero or the person who first really pushed the psychological reality thesis for representations and rules. Okay? But in this 1995 paper, where Chomsky is arguing against externalism in psychology, he puts forward a very skeptical account of content. Okay? So this is a lengthy quote from this particular paper. Chomsky's talking about Marr and Ullman's work on vision, and this is what he says. He says, studies of determination of structure from motion use tachistoscope presentations that cause a subject to see a rotating cube, though there is no such thing in the environment. If Ullman could have stimulated the retina directly, he would have done that, or the optic nerve. But there's no meaningful question about the content of the internal representations of a person seeing a cube under the conditions of the experiments, or if the retina is stimulated by a rotating cube, or a video of a rotating cube, or about the content of a frog's representation of a fly or moving dot in the standard experimental studies of frog vision. And this is really the critical part. He says, no notion like content or representation of figures within the theory. So there are no answers to be given as to their nature. Representation is not to be understood relationally as representation of. Okay, well that to me sounds pretty deflationary, right? He's a realist about the vehicles. He thinks the vehicles are these causal structures that exist in the brain. But he just doesn't seem to think that the notion of content plays any real role in the theory. And he even seems to deny that there actually is any kind of content, because he denies that there's such a thing as representation of, or that representations are stand in any kind of interesting relation to something else. Okay, so that's what leads Frankie to suggest that it's a kind of ersatz representationalism. All right, so what are we to make of this? Well, first off, it's actually not clear if Chomsky takes himself to be interpreting Marr and Ullman, or if he's just giving his own normative view about how we ought to think about content. If it's the former, I think there's lots of passages to suggest that he's misinterpreting them, that they think content does play an important role in their theory. But let's just, for the sake of charity, assume that he's giving his own normative view of content. He's saying this is how we ought to think about content. We should just think that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really play any kind of role. Well, it's not clear why Chomsky thinks this, but one of his motivations seems to be that representational tokens can be triggered or caused in a variety of different ways. Right? So he makes a big deal about how an image of a rotating cube can be caused by an actual rotating cube, or a tachistoscope presentation, or even, at least in principle, by directly stimulating the retina or even the optic nerve. And this seems to be what motivates him to say, therefore, there's no meaningful question about content, there really is no representation of. Well, if that is the motivation, it seems to me that's a lousy reason for being a content skeptic, right? We've known for a long time that representations can be caused in a variety of different ways. And that's actually why almost everybody has given up on simplistic theories of content, simplistic causal theories of content, right? And that's why most people have supplemented simplistic causal theory of content with a variety of other sorts of bells and whistles and mechanisms, such that we can distinguish the content grounding causal relations from the aberrant causes. It seems to me that if you have an image of a rotating cube and it's triggered by just directly stimulating the retina, let's say, then that's just a straightforward case of misrepresentation. That's just a straightforward case of something representing the world in a way that it isn't. Okay, so I don't know quite why he thinks this is a good reason to be a content skeptic if this is his motivation. But look, I actually don't need to argue against his motivations for being a content skeptic. All I need to show, or all I need to argue, is that you can't be a content skeptic in this way and at the same time describe this vehicle, describe the structures as representations. So in her paper, Frankie argues that Chomsky is actually a limitivist about content. And I actually think she's right about that. But I would simply add that if you're an limitivist about content, then you're just an limitivist about representation, right? Because you can't have representation without representation of something. It really is essentially a relational kind of thing, a relational kind of entity. So, on my view, Chomsky's ersatz representationalism just collapses into straightforward eliminativism. Really, Chomsky's an eliminativist about representations, and there really is no third option here. Okay? All right. The next sort of account I want to talk about is much more explicitly deflationist in nature, and this is Mark Spivak's account. So in a recent interesting paper, Spivak suggests that we should treat the positing of representations in cognitive theories as a kind of fictionalism. Okay? And he has a name for it. It's neural representational fictionalism, or NRF for short. Okay? And so this is what he says. He says, according to NRF, statements of the following form are false. 5. Neuron brain region activity X represents Y. That claim is false. However, statements of the form 5 nevertheless serve a useful function and in fact are fact-stating. Okay, so basically the idea here is just as a lot of philosophers have promoted some kind of fictionalism to deal with ontologically problematic things like abstract entities and modal facts and non-existent entities, Spivak suggests that we should also adopt, or at least proposes that you could also adopt fictionalism as a way of dealing with representation. Okay. Now, initially, this account is appealing at least because you can avoid a lot of the counterintuitive aspects of eliminativism, a lot of the counterintuitive consequences of eliminativism, and still retain a place for representation in your theory. But at the same time, you wouldn't have to give a naturalistic neurological account of representations because you'd be acknowledging that they don't actually exist in the brain. So there's a sense in which it retains some of the nice aspects of eliminativism and some of the nice aspects of realism if it can be made to work. Okay. Now, in his elaboration of the theory, Spivak suggests that fictional claims have kind of this odd relationship to the truth, right? On the one hand, fictional claims are just straightforwardly false. So the claim that Sherlock Holmes is a brilliant detective who's based in London and solves all sorts of interesting crimes, that's just straightforwardly false. But he argues that there's another context in which, in some sense, those claims are true, right? In the context of the fictional work of the Hound of Baskerville, the claim that Sherlock Holmes is a brilliant detective who's based in London and solves an important mystery, in that context, that claim is true. So what he suggests is that perhaps in cognitive science, in our cognitive theorizing, or what he refers to as the neural representational fiction, the claim that brain region X represents Y can actually be true in this way. So that's one way in which you can sort of be a fictionalist and yet cling to some sort of notion of truth. Okay. Well, again, what are we to make of this? Well, to be fair to Mark, it's actually not at all clear that he intends to endorse this. In fact, at the end of his paper, he offers a couple of pretty strong arguments against it. So I think what's really going on here is he's just sort of putting this out there as an interesting proposal, as something that we should consider. So I say, fine, let's consider it. It seems to me that there are really two big problems that NRF has, and I can't quite see how it's going to overcome these problems. The first problem has to do with a huge disanalogy that exists between what we're trying to do in fictional works on the one hand and what we're trying to do in scientific theorizing on the other hand. See, NRF is based on the idea that there's some kind of context in which the claims of the representational theorists are true, even if there aren't any such representations that exist in the brain. And the problem is I just don't really see how science provides that kind of context. Right? I mean, when you're doing fiction, what you're doing is you're creating a possible world with different sorts of events and characters and so on. And things are a certain way in that possible world that they're not in the real world. Okay? But nobody's interested in creating a possible world of brain function in cognitive science, right? That's different from the real world. See, nobody's really interested in a purely fictional account of how the brain works, right? So in cognitive science, there is really no contextual separation between how things are in the theory or model on the one hand and how things are in the real world on the other hand, at least no intended contextual separation. How things are in the theory or model is supposed to capture how things are in the real world. So in cognitive theorizing, truth within the context of a scientific theory or a cognitive representational theory is just good old-fashioned truth. It's just straightforward truth. So that if these things don't exist, then the theory is just straightforwardly false. So that seems to me one big problem. A second problem is, well, it seems to me that actually a fictionalist can admit that and say, okay, well, I'm giving up on any kind of pretense to truth. But I still think there's some pragmatic value. There's some pragmatic benefit from adopting a fictionalist perspective on the way we invoke representations. But see, that brings us to the second problem. And the second problem is that it's much, much harder for a fictional account of some phenomenon to bestow those pragmatic benefits than it is for an account that accurately, correctly describes the phenomenon and what brings it about in the first place, right? In fact, Spivak himself even admits that for certain pragmatic goals, looks like neural representational fictionalism isn't going to work too well. So for example, for the goal of explaining cognitive processes, well, surely one of the key features of the best explanation is that it accurately captures what's really going on. So for that goal, it looks like fictionalism isn't going to fare too well. Also, we invoke representations to account for the causal processes. But of course, fictional entities can't engage in causal relations, so it looks like that goal is not going to be captured either. But Spivak does think that there are other desiderata, theoretical desiderata, other pragmatic goals that fictionalism could accommodate. So for example, he suggests that neural representational fictionalism could yield accurate predictions of cognitive phenomena, because we know that for a theory to yield accurate predictions, it doesn't have to be completely true. And he also suggests that neural representational fictionalism could yield useful descriptions of a given phenomenon, because sometimes at least helpful descriptions involve fictional entities, like for example in gas theory when we appeal to the perfectly elastic billiard ball-like atoms. Okay. And then finally he suggests that the fictionalist account could also help us intervene in various ways and manipulate the system in various ways because, of course, again, sometimes intervention does rely on fictional entities. You might, appeal to a fictional centrifugal force if you want to intervene and spin an object or something like that. Okay, well, I admit that a fictionalist account could possibly yield these benefits, but it seems to me that that's far too weak a standard for evaluating any kind of fictionalism, right? I mean, what we really want to know, is there any reason to think it's likely that a fictionalist interpretation will yield these benefits, right? What's the chances that this is actually going to happen? And there, Spivak doesn't say anything. Right? He doesn't give us any reasons for thinking that we ought to expect a fictional story to yield these pragmatic benefits. Going the other way, I think there are all sorts of reasons for thinking that a realist account, an account that accurately describes the structures and processes and mechanisms involved in some phenomenon, including the brain, one that accurately describes that process is far more likely to yield all sorts of pragmatic benefits, right? It's more likely to give us accurate predictions because we're going to understand the actual workings. The description should be useful because it's accurate. It's telling us how the thing actually works. And it seems to me that if you really understand the system and how it operates, then that's far more likely to allow you to manipulate it in various ways and to intervene with it in various ways. Okay? So it seems to me there's really good reason for supposing that a realist account is going to yield these pragmatic benefits. And I don't see any reasons yet for thinking that a fictionalist account will do so. Okay, now maybe here's one way of thinking about this. Let's suppose, apart from our theoretical interests, there are two ontological possibilities with regard to what's happening in the brain. Either it's the case that these representations are really in there, or it's the case that they're not. So let's consider each of these. Let's suppose that the representations really are in there. Well, then it seems to me that fictionalism is just a really bad idea, right? I mean, maybe it'll get us off the hook in terms of accounting for how representations can be neurally realized. But if they actually are neurally realized, we should get to work and explain how that goes. It seems to me that fictionalism would just be sort of an excuse for not doing our proper work. Okay, let's go the other way. Suppose that those neurological structures are such that there are no representations there. Okay. Then we have to ask, which would be the best outcome for cognitive science? Would it be best if we keep talking about representations, keep invoking representational theories, cling to the representational paradigm, even though we've abandoned a sort of realist interpretation of representations? Or would it instead be better if we simply drop talk of representations, right, and got to work developing a new paradigm with different ontology that accurately captures what's going on in the brain? Now, in answering this question, I think it's really important to notice one thing. One common motivation for fictionalism in science wouldn't apply in this case. But I said earlier, one motivation for fictionalism is to account for really problematic entities, like abstract entities, numbers, modal facts, things like that. But neural representations aren't really problematic entities in that way. They're not ontologically problematic. They're supposed to be real structures in the brain. So at least that motivation wouldn't apply. Okay, so now we're asking, okay, suppose we have some reason for thinking that the neural representations, there are cognitive representations that are invoked, don't really exist. What should we do? Well, I think the history of science provides guidance here. And that guidance points in the direction of eliminativism. Right? Because think about it. Somebody could have endorsed a fictionalist interpretation of theories that involve phlogiston, celestial spheres, the humors of the body, the élan vital, all of these different sorts of things that we brought from our theoretical ontology. We could have adopted a fictionalist interpretation of those, but I think we're all glad that we didn't. Right? We're glad that we didn't because it was important for us to eliminate those things from our theoretical ontology so we could go on to do the necessary work that was needed to gain a much more accurate understanding of these different sort of phenomena. And I think the exact same thing applies to representations in the brain, right? If we really have reason to think that they don't exist, then fictionalism would thwart scientific development. It would keep us from doing the work we ought to be doing in trying to develop a more accurate account of how the brain works. Okay, so that's why I think neurorepresentational fictionalism just doesn't work. But I will make one concession to Mark. I will make one concession to the fictionalist. And it has to do with the way we talk about information when we talk about representation. We often speak as if information is some kind of thing or substance. You know, it gets carried over, it gets relayed, it gets stored in various ways. And I think we should treat this kind of language as being very figurative, right? I mean, what's really going on is there's some kind of correspondence between the representation and the world, and then there's the exploitation of that correspondence. That's what's really going on when we talk about information. But this language appears to reify it into a kind of thing, and in that case, I think some kind of a fictionalist interpretation of information as a sort of reified thing is probably the right way to go. So I'll concede that with regard to information. Okay, am I doing on time? Okay, let me get going here. So the last account I want to talk about is Frankie's account. And I'm going to focus actually more on her 2014 paper than on her talk, but I think a lot of what I have to say will have bearing on her talk. Frankie gives an account of representation in cognitive theories that invoke computational processes, like those involved in Marr's account of early vision, or Shadmire and Wise's account of motor processing. So I want to talk about that. Before I jump in, I want to say a couple of things. Number one, I think Frankie is really to be commended because I think she really digs deep and does her homework and looks at what is actually going on in the science. So I think it's an excellent account in that regard. I think she does a really good job of capturing what the scientists are actually saying. Secondly, the sense in which I think she's a deflationist is a very, very weak sense. I think she's kind of a quasi-deflationist. So here's the fence between realism and deflationism. I think she's just slightly on the deflationary side of the fence, so I want to nudge her over to the realist side of the fence. So I think I agree with Eric. Eric was trying to push her in the direction of eliminalism, like, no, you got to come over here to the realist side, basically. All right. So in Frankie's account that she presents in this paper, she focuses upon the kind of notion of representation that appears in computational theories of cognition, and she claims that the representations that appear have two very distinct types of content. First off, there's the type of content that is associated with the representations that are there for the particular function that's being computed. And as Frankie notes, the function is quite often mathematical in nature. Okay? So for example, in Marr's account of early vision, he talks about a subsystem that's computing an operation that has a Laplacian function in it. Basically, it's an image smoothing filter, and as Frankie points out, it's sort of computing the Laplacian of the Gaussian. Now, don't ask me to explain the mathematics of this. I like to say it's just too complicated for you to understand, but it's too complicated for me to fully understand. So the bottom line is that it's a mathematical function that's being computed. And so, given as a mathematical function, the inputs and outputs, the arguments and values are mathematical entities. They're numerical values. But of course, you can't have mathematical entities instantiated in the brain. So what's in the brain are representations of mathematical entities. So that's what she refers to as the mathematical content of these inputs and outputs. But it's also the case, she argues, that those same input and output representations have a very different sort of content, a more conventional sort of content that helps us see the relevance of that mathematical function for the broader cognitive task that's being carried out. Okay, so, in the visual system that Marr talks about, there is this Laplacian filter. It's not there just for fun. It's there to perform a certain function in visual processing. And very roughly speaking, what it's roughly there to do is convert representations of light intensity into roughly representations of edges and borders. Okay? Frankie refers to this as the cognitive content, and the cognitive content is there to help us understand this from the standpoint of the psychological explanandum that we're interested in. Okay. Now, so we have two kinds of content. We've got mathematical content, cognitive content. To me, all this sounds really good. It reminds me of what I discussed in my book as the input-output notion of representation, only frankly, I think her account's more sophisticated because it captures this sort of dual content. The only thing I might add is it seems to me that the function being computed doesn't always have to be mathematical in nature. It could, for example, be a logical function, and so you could have something in there that's a modus ponenzer or something like that. And we can talk about what that might do to the content. But I do think she captures what's going on in a lot of these computational theories. But there's one aspect of her account that I have a problem with, and that's what she has to say about the cognitive content. For Egan, for Franke, only the mathematical content is essential. And this relates to some degree to her talk. The cognitive content is non-essential, and it's really there just for our explanatory interests. It's really there for our parochial interests. Okay, so here's a lengthy quote from her paper. Cognitive contents are not part of the essential characterization of the device and are not fruitfully regarded as part of the computational theory proper. They are ascribed to facilitate the explanation of cognitive capacity in question and are sensitive to a host of pragmatic considerations. Hence they form what I call the intentional gloss, a gloss that shows in a perspicuous way how the computational mathematical theory manages to explain the intentionally described explanatum with which we began. Contents defined on distal objects, what we normally think of as the normal kind of contents, and properties appropriate to the cognitive domain, what I call cognitive contents, are not in the theory. They're in the explanatory gloss that accompanies the theory, where they're used to show that the theory addresses the phenomena for which we sought an explanation. Okay, so cognitive content, it's non-essential. It seems like non-essential either for the device or for our theory about how the mechanism works. And it's really just there for our explanatory interests. That's pretty close to what she was talking about in her talk. And to my mind, that sounds pretty deflationary. Sounds pretty deflationary about cognitive content. But it's not 100% clear to me why she adopts this deflationary stance. Okay? Why not instead just say that the cognitive contents are there essentially for this computational system qua psychological mechanism. Not qua mathematical mechanism, but qua cognitive mechanism. That the cognitive contents are essentially there for that purpose. I mean, that's why the system evolved the way it did. Right? I mean, this component of the visual system that Marr talks about, it's not like, it evolved to be a little mathematician. No, it evolved to help with visual processing. That's the job it's doing. And in that job, in that role, it's converting light intensities into edges and borders. So it seems to me that that's actually a really key aspect of what it's doing, not just from our perspective, but why it's actually there, why it's objectively there. Now, in the paper, it seems to me that Franke endorses this deflationary or demoted view of cognitive content because it turns out you could take the mathematical system out of the cognitive system and plug it into a different system and it would still compute the exact same mathematical function, even though now it might have some sort of different cognitive content. So you could take the mechanism out of Marr's visual system, the Laplacian, the Gaussian computer, stick it in some other system, and it would still be performing that mathematical function, but now it would have different cognitive contents. Okay? And to her, it seems that this is perhaps a motivation for treating cognitive content as less essential. She says the representational vehicles do not have their cognitive contents essentially. If the mechanism characterized in mathematical terms by the theory were embedded differently in the organism, perhaps allowing it to subserve a different cognitive capacity, then the structures would be assigned different cognitive contents. Okay, so it seems that this is transportability that leads her to suggest we should demote the cognitive content. Okay, but I guess I don't see why that should matter with regard to the current cognitive content. Yes, you could take this mathematical system and plug it into a different system. It would then be embedded in a different environment, and it would therefore have different cognitive content. But I don't see why that should in any way demote or undermine the current cognitive content it has, given the system it's now embedded in. But I mean, we already recognize, just broadly speaking, with regard to biological systems, you can take them out and put them in some other broader system, and they might perform some different sort of function, but we don't think that undermines its current role, right? I mean, my heart has the function of pumping blood, and that's objectively true, even if we could take my heart out of my body and stick it in an alien's body where it would pump some other kind of substance. And it seems to me the same is true about robustly representational systems, right? That fuel gauge in my car could be taken out and plugged into some other system where it would no longer tell me the amount of fuel in some tank, it could tell me the amount of some other kind of liquid that it's connected to. But that counterfactual, it seems to me, doesn't do anything to undermine its current representational role. Okay, so I don't see why this transportability should motivate us to note or to view the cognitive content as simply an intentional gloss. But one way to maybe think about this is talk about one of Marr's own examples. In his book, he talks about something functioning as an adder in a cash register. Okay? And of course, if it's functioning as an adder, then its inputs are representations of numbers and its outputs are representations of sums. But as it's functioning in the cash register, these numbers aren't completely abstract entities. They correspond to the actual prices of items that are being purchased and the overall amount that's due. And Marr argues that this is really important to understand the adder in this way, with this broader kind of content, for answering an important why question. Right? The why question is, why is there an adder in the cash register and not, say, a multiplier? And as Oren has pointed out, or Chagrin has pointed out in a really important paper, the answer to that why question is that addition is a mathematical function that properly captures the financial reality of how overall amounts due are determined. So that's why it's an adder in there and not something else. And it seems to me that the exact same sort of point applies to the cognitive mechanisms. Now notice that in the cash register, the adder could be taken out. You could take the adder out and plug it into some other kind of machine, right? You could plug it into a coin counter. And when you do that, the representations, the input representations of the adder would stand for something different. They'd stand for the values of coins. But that counterfactual fact doesn't in any way alter the important content of the adder in the cash register. Okay? So the bottom line is that I think Frankie's right that we appeal to the cognitive content to help us with our explanatory purposes, to help us with a better understand what the thing is doing. But I don't see that as any kind of an intentional gloss or any kind of heuristic gloss. I think that's an essential thing you need to do to understand the system. Or maybe the way to put this is to say, if it is a gloss, it's no more of a gloss than, say, viewing a biological system as playing a functional role. Or no more of a gloss than viewing neurological structures as computing some kind of mathematical function. In fact, it seems to me that if there's any kind of content that's a candidate for demotion or is simply there as an add-on for our explanatory purposes, it's the mathematical content, not the cognitive content, right? I mean, it's definitely beneficial for us to be able to recognize this mathematical function as one that we're familiar with. But if we were mathematically naive and we didn't recognize it, it seems to me we could still understand the psychological role, the cognitive role of this mechanism as something that converts representations of light intensity into representations of edges and borders. Okay, so if anything, it seems to me it's the mathematical. Now, I don't want to demote any of these contents. I think that they're both important for understanding the different way of interpreting or different way of looking at what the mathematical system is actually doing. But to me, it seems to me that the cognitive content actually is there essentially by virtue of the fact that this mechanism is a cognitive mechanism, it's a psychological mechanism. Okay, so let me just sum up here. Basically what I'm claiming is that whereas Chomsky's view collapses into a limitivism, I actually think the proper position for Frankie to take is realism. She should be a realist about that cognitive content, and she should view it as essential to that particular representational device. All right, so just some quick conclusions. I think robust representational realism can tolerate various problematic features of representation. I think there's good reason for treating representational realism as the actual position of cognitive theorists. I think there's good reason for treating representational realism as a position we ought to hold, the normative position. So the burden is on the deflationists to show why that's the wrong stance. And I think the deflationist accounts that are out there have deep problems where they collapse into realism or eliminativism, so the burden is not met. Okay, so basically I'm saying you really got only two options here. You can't really go halfway in between. So just to leave you here with a character from one of my favorite TV shows, Breaking Bad. This is the basic idea here. Okay, thanks.